Welcome, dear readers. You're listening to Time to Read, a Winnipeg Public Library podcast book club. We're recording today from the Carol Shields Auditorium at Millennium Library in Winnipeg, which is within Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Innu, and Dakota peoples, and in the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Our drinking water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation in Treaty 3 territory. In this episode, we will be discussing A Grandmother Begins the Story by Michelle Porter. I'm Dennis from the Idea Mill, and I think I'd like to try turning into a bison for a while, too. Across the table from me is...
I'm Toby. I'm an outreach librarian based out of here at Millennium Library, and I have nothing clever to say this month. And across the table from me is...
I'm Trevor. I'm the branch head of the Louis Riel Library, and I think Louis Riel probably enjoyed the occasional Métis jig in his time. I have no proof of that.
It's very likely.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
A good book can carry me away from an average and ordinary day, yeah. So keep it down, leave me alone, close the doors and turn off the phone, 'cause all I ever really need is a little more time to read.
And you, dear readers, we wouldn't do this without you, and we'd love to hear a bit of your story, too. But don't wait until you're in the spirit world, because we know time works differently there. You can find our email address and all our social media outlets by going to wpl-podcast.winnipeg.ca and scrolling to the bottom of the page. Hang around till the end of the episode to enjoy our favorite segment, Nerd Words for Word Nerds. Toby's going to tell us about the author, and then Trevor is going to give us a summary of the book.
Michelle Porter. She is a writer and academic. She has a BA in journalism, an MA in folklore, and another MA in English, and a PhD in geography. She's from a long line of Métis storytellers and a member of the Manitoba Métis Federation. Her first book, which is a collection of poetry called Inquiries, was published in 2019 and was shortlisted for the Pat Lowther Memorial Award. Her second book, 2020's Approaching Fire, was creative nonfiction about her great-grandfather, who was a fiddler from the Red River. It was shortlisted for the Indigenous Voices Award. In 2002, she published Scratching River, which explores her Métis heritage through her older brother's story. Grandmother Tells the Story, which came out this year, is her first work of fiction. She's won numerous awards for her poetry and journalism and has been published in literary journals and magazines across Canada. She currently is teaching creative writing and Métis literature at Memorial University, and her academic work focuses on home, memory, and women's changing relationships with the land.
All right. So, A Grandmother Begins the Story by Michelle Porter. Now, it's kind of an interesting, complicated story that the first question I had was, well, which grandmother and which story? So, in fact, there are, I would say, 5 main characters, and at least 2 of them could be the grandmothers, maybe 3, depending on how far you want to go. So I thought maybe we'd just talk a little bit about some of the stories that intertwine. So we have the youngest of the main characters, Carter. She's a young mom who is recently separated from her husband, and she has recently reconnected with her birth mom, Allie. Because she was placed for adoption when she was a baby. And so she's learning about her culture for the first time and trying to reconcile with her mom and all the feelings of abandonment and not belonging that come along with that. And so then Allie's mother is Lucy. Lucy and Allie have a very, very fraught relationship. And so Lucy has cut out the middleman completely and reached out to Carter, who she thinks will help her get the means to end her life. We have Lucy's mother, Genevieve, and Genevieve is a woman in her late 70s, early 80s who has received a diagnosis that she is not going to live for very much longer, but she is determined that she is going to get herself clean off of alcohol before she passes into the afterlife. And so at the ripe old age of whatever she is, she checks herself into a rehab center. And then Genevieve's mother, Mame, is the matriarch of this entire line of women, and she has passed over into the afterlife, but she still has ties to this life. She can't seem to let go, or there's unfinished work to be done before she can join all of her ancestors. So all of these stories are intertwined and interconnected. And then there's also another character, Dee, who is a bison. And she is given just as much storyline or room on the page as these other characters. And her story is no less interesting and heartbreaking about falling in love and having a child and separation and betrayal as well. So altogether, we can talk about which grandmother is the grandmother and maybe which story is the story. And that's my summary.
That's as good a summary as I can imagine, because this one, there are so many interlocking storylines. It's really tricky to kind of summarize it quickly. How did you guys find it?
I struggled with this book. I think the writing is beautiful. I think I can really tell that Michelle Porter is a poet. But I guess I found it a bit muddled. A lot of characters to keep straight. I kept having to remind myself who was the mother or grandmother of who. I felt like the storylines didn't always intersect in ways that were super important to the narrative, which is maybe why I kept getting the characters confused. Like at times it just felt like a bunch of short stories that had been cut up and then interspersed together. Yeah, so that's what I didn't like about it. But I mean, at the same time, I think that Porter's trying to move away from a traditional kind of like Western white narrative structure with a defined plot and a beginning and a middle and an end. And maybe this is trying to replicate more of that oral storytelling tradition. So maybe I just found that disorientating and distracting. I guess I wanted to like this book more than I did, and so I'm trying to find ways to justify it in my mind.
Well, I really leaned into this one, and for some of the same reasons that Toby just said, like I found it initially difficult to really connect the characters to each other and how they're related. So I found myself actually writing like a family tree as I was going, and with little arrows back and forth. And I've just replicated a little bit of it here just for my own notes. And by doing that, I felt like I got into the story more than if I was just sort of passively reading it, because as I was jotting down these notes on all these characters and maybe their characteristics and how they're related, I started to feel like I got to know these characters, but not in the conventional way you get to know a character in a novel. You sort of came at them from the side or from snippets like you would in a family, where you would hear stories about a relative that maybe you haven't met. Or we all know in our families, we always have these stories that seem to always get told at family events, and they come back and they become part of a mythology. And all of these characters were, all kind of broken, and obviously intergenerational trauma is a huge theme throughout this in so many different ways. And I think you're right, Toby. Like the plots, they don't really maybe mesh in the conventional sense. And I'm thinking like, yeah, maybe that was intentional. Maybe we're supposed to look at this like, no, this doesn't all add up, and this isn't all in a line, and it's messy, and it's sort of moving at its own pace and its own beat. The whole thing with involving not just the bison as a character, but there were other unconventional characters. There were the two dogs that had a lovely little relationship when they were put into the kennel, and there was even Genevieve's car, and even the land itself. So it kind of made me think, how all things are related and related. Maybe this is one kind of literal way of showing that. I don't know.
When I started this book, like I'll say the first 40 pages or so, I didn't think I was going to like it, because it's clearly literary, not the more popular fiction that I tend to find easier and more enjoyable to read. And when you start anthropomorphizing like the ground and the animals and stuff, that often doesn't work for me, because I just find people are really bad at anthropomorphizing animals, especially. I believe animals have their own internal life, and that it would be interesting to know how they think, but I just think we're not good at knowing how to do that.
Isn't it just food?
No, though, it isn't. I mean, do you have a pet?
Yeah, I have a cat.
Yeah. Well, your cat has a deep, rich life, right? Like,
well, yeah,
it's just hard to figure out.
Food and love.
Yeah, but they still, I feel like animals have personalities and individual things, but usually I don't like it when they're anthropomorphized in novels, because I find it tends to be too cutesy and such. So I was prepared to not like this book, but I warmed up to it over time, which I wasn't expecting. I'm not sure exactly why, because none of those elements really changed. There's a lot of like magical realism in the book, a lot of the different descriptions of spirituality and the afterlife and things like that, which again are not normally my cup of tea. But something about it still kind of worked when I don't know, got into the flow of it. The writing didn't like catch me, like it wasn't like breathtaking writing from my perspective, but it was solid and it moved forward, and the characters were very flawed, all of them. They all had issues coming from their background and their experiences, but they were all trying to figure something out, and they were trying to find their place, and they kind of manage it, sort of, although, again, also, I don't really know what to take from the book in terms of meaning. I feel like there were a lot of different stories and a lot of elements you can draw from it, and there probably is a more grand narrative you can put to it than I didn't get from it. But it didn't bother me that much with this one. I felt like the ending was satisfying enough. So I'm not like, I'm not gushing over the book, but it's better than I expected it to be, and I think a lot of people might enjoy it. But it is a non-traditional narrative, or not from the traditions I'm used to reading. And we were talking a bit about this before the podcast too, but with all the different characters and all the different things, I wish I had gotten the audiobook version of this, because when I looked at the audiobook listing on Libby, there are a lot of different voice actors listed. So I'm assuming that means that each character in the book got their own voice actor. And I feel like the interlocking narrative with those different voices in your ear probably would work really, really well with this story. But yeah, my impression of it was, it's better than I expected it to be. And I ended up enjoying reading it.
What you said would twig something that I had thought too, that the novel as a whole felt to me like some of those sort of ancient teachings that we may hear, and we get from it what we need to get from it. And different people will get different things. And so that's why it's interesting to talk about, to hear what parts of it kind of spoke to us and might be different, and what parts stood out to us because it might be different for everyone who reads it. It's kind of almost like a mirror that's being held up to us. And I have to admit, it took a very long time, longer than I'd like to admit, to me to figure out in the bison chapters that they were actually talking about bison. I was like, why do all these women have beards? and it took me so I'm just saying, like, yeah, some people are quicker than others, and I'm on the end of the curve.
I did appreciate the fact that all of the chapters or sections had the name of the person it was about in it.
Yeah.
It made it a lot easier for me to remember all the characters, and to, after several of the sections like that, to have a history of them in my head, so it'd make it a little easier to follow. Because, yeah, there were a lot of characters to keep track of, and the relationships were important, but also not always super explicitly described each time.
Would you say there was a main character? Although there are multiple characters, was there any one story that maybe either of you connected with over any others?
I liked the Carter and the Genevieve stories the most. When I reached those chapters, I was happy to be there again. Carter, I guess, just because she's the youngest, and I feel like I related to her the most out of anyone. And Jen, just because she was funny.
I like the bison stuff a lot, I'll have to admit. And again, for someone who doesn't normally like anthropomorphizing the animals, I enjoyed the bison story.
Can we talk about the bison story?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I couldn't quite see how it fit in here. I mean, it's obviously like a story of colonization and multi-generational trauma. But I mean, at the heart of it, it's just about like a horny buffalo who makes terrible decisions.
Yeah,
right?
but that's pretty much the same as the story for all of the humans too, right? They all ended up in bad relationships, or something about their relationship was like a driving factor in their lives.
But I wasn't on Dee's side in the same way I was on the human side. Like, I just feel like Dee was just making these awful decisions at the detriment of her son. She was just like lovesick and just going after Jay and didn't care about anything else.
Yeah, like the main character from our last novel, which you really liked.
Yeah, good point.
There's Dee the buffalo doing the same stuff.
Because it was a buffalo.
Yeah.
We're all horny buffaloes at heart. I think Toby, I think that's really one of the truths that come out of this book.
And the fact is, all bison are horny, literally. They have them right on the front of the head there.
Good point. Good point.
I mean, part of the reason I like the bison story is just I like cattle, and oddly enough, right? Like, cows are beautiful and they're sweet, and I'm just kind of, I guess, maybe transferring some of those feelings to the bison, just herding together and nuzzling. They're bumping their heads against each other, and then still dealing with social or like community issues, you know.
And for me, the bison, they almost were eternal. Like some of the stories with Dee, you almost forgot that it was taking place during like post-contact. These were bison living on the land, and then you're reminded, no, there's fences and they're getting out. But then there's also the bison in the afterlife that are sort of helping Mamé along. And are they the same bison? Are they? There's a connection that can almost travel between worlds. And did I have this right where in the bison story, part of it was they were trying to reintroduce the herd, like the herd had been decimated. And so a lot of it was trying to, like, there were two facilities, right? Where one on the Canadian side, one on the American side, and they were trying to almost reintroduce bison into the environment. Is that part of it?
That seems to be it, right? Yeah. Like, because when the protesters were there trying to prevent the group of bison we were following who had broken through the fence, who were trying to prevent them getting shot, there was some mention of they broke out of the park. Yeah. So I'm assuming that that's like a park that's being used as a preserve to help reintroduce and like preserve the bison. So yeah, and it does sound like they came from the U.S. side. I was often confused about where everybody was too, because there was that mention at one point of being in the U.S. and I thought, but wait, they're Métis? Like, I always associate the Métis with, well, this region of the continent, and I didn't imagine a lot in the U.S., but then later on they kind of mention Alberta, BC, Winnipeg, so then it brings it back to Canada. But the bison thing I was really uncertain of until it sounded like, yeah, they had basically gotten into Alberta by breaking through the fence and crossing the border. There was some vagueness in the story where it was a little difficult to tell. She doesn't spell it out. She just lets you kind of piece together those little bits.
Yeah, I found like the vagueness, what happened more in the bison chapters than in the others. Because you're right, it was vague, and then all of a sudden she's mentioning like the Deerfoot Trail in Calgary and Claire's home, and like you say, other places that you could really pinpoint where these stories are taking place. For me, I think my favorite storyline was the Genevieve storyline. I felt like I could kind of relate to her spirit. It kind of reminded me of my own grandma in terms of just the determination and the humor. And also I was getting kind of like Margaret Lawrence vibes off of her, kind of a Stone Angel kind of character. So I really enjoyed, her time talking to the other patients and the staff and reading their cards and how she was able to reconnect with the ghost of her sister through the music.
Who's Gabe? I didn't quite get that. He was a ghost, right? Like a spirit?
He must have been. I mean, the only thing I could think of is Gabriel Dumont, but it wasn't tied into. And then in that very first chapter with Genevieve, she's talking to somebody, but then you find out they're not really there, right? She's talking to a ghost.
her husband.
Gabe was the assistant there, or he was one of the staff at the facility, wasn't he?
Well, she kind of meets him out in the outside, but then he appears at the oddest times.
Yeah.
And I did definitely get the sense
he appears and disappears.
That he was more than a helper, or
Oh, okay. That didn't occur to me while reading it. I just assumed he was one of the staff and that he, like, maybe a little inappropriately was showing up at like midnight to talk to people. But like, given the kind of irregular nature of a lot of the interactions between people, I didn't really, but I guess that's a possibility. Yeah. Because she was talking to her dead sister.
And her dead husband before she went to the facility.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that wasn't spelled out, but now I don't know.
Was her husband wasn't Gabe, was it?
No, his name was like Robert
name.
Or something, I think.
Okay.
Again, that was the first time I was like, wait a second now.
Just this vagueness coming back that just kind of muddles the water,
Yeah.
Yeah. But that is kind of a theme, or like Trevor was saying before, it's messy. All the characters' lives are messy. The way they interact, the way they make decisions, and the whole story is messy. Kind of like when they're talking about the music. There was a lot of talk about music and how they're playing it crooked. It doesn't get played straight. Mm-hmm. And the whole story is like that. Nothing is straight. It's not a straightforward story. And so some of that vague, and I mean, some of the characters like Carter, seems to go on a bit of a bender here or there, seems to be having difficulty sorting out her thoughts at different times. So some of the details kind of get muddled because you're seeing it from their perspective in each section. And it's messy.
Yeah. In fact, while you're saying that, I just happened to turn to the book randomly. I opened to a chapter that was just called Mamet and the Crookedness of Time. So even the time is crooked. And despite the crookedness of the story, there were a few moments that I thought were really, really kind of artfully done. There was a section towards the end of the novel where the idea of like sweat and heat was a common theme. Like we had chapters back to back to back where we had Mamet in the sweat lodge on the brink of the afterlife, doing the work that she needed to do to go on. And that was interspersed with Genevieve playing the piano in the common room of the rehab center right before that storm of all storms happened. And you could just feel the heat and the humidity in the room. And then it would cut to Carter, who was on that bus and the air conditioning was broken and everyone was hot. And I just thought, well, that's a very clever through line that's connecting these three characters. And it doesn't, I don't think Michelle Porter was hitting us over the head with it, but every once in a while there are these kind of moments where the story, you kind of took a step back and you could see sort of themes that were weaving through all these lives that the characters themselves weren't aware of at the time, but that there was sort of a bigger power that was there with them. I thought that was kind of cool.
There were some interesting things in there that also I still don't understand, so I got to ask your opinion. So Carter and Grandma Lucy, and they have their whole back and forth kind of dance about, is she going to get her pills? Is she not? And then she gives her like a bag of a bunch of pills and says, some of them are sugar, some of them are aspirin, some of them are the pills you want, and gives them to her. And then there's the whole, what did you give her? She took all these pills. Now she wants to go to the hospital thing. So it's like, we're like, did she take all of the pills? Were they all aspirin? Like, we don't really know. And then there's that like last texts coming from Lucy to Carter where she says something like, I don't quite remember exactly what it was, but she says something like, you think I don't know what aspirin and sugar pills look like or taste like? And then she gives kind of an LOL type thing, like, and it made me wonder, like, wait, were you playing this all along? You just wanted the pill so you could pretend to commit suicide? Like, what happened exactly there?
Page 318. She texted, I kept these ones. Makes me happy to keep them close, just in case. You think I can't tell what aspirin is? Think I can't taste sugar? She added a laugh until you cry emoji. Nothing else. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what that...
I can't figure out her game there exactly. Or maybe she is just doing that as a like, oh, this didn't work. Oh, well, now I'm going to send a I knew it all anyway type message. Or, I don't know.
I mean, she was definitely a gaslighter, and she obviously had a broken relationship with her own daughter, Allie. So maybe that was just one more way to say, well, I'm going to get the final word in here kind of thing. I don't know. I didn't like Lucy.
She was the hardest character to like, yeah. I mean, naming your daughter Alan because you wanted a son and then always referring to them as Alan, even though they don't want to be called Alan. It's like, that's not nice.
I did love towards the end how Carter gathered up her, I don't know, would they be her like, stepsisters or her half-sisters and made that run to the rehab to rescue Genevieve because they got a call. That whole thing was just so like madcap. And then there's that guy Jesus who shows up at the right time, and there were moments like that were just sort of kind of fun, if you can call it parts of this book fun.
Yeah, and if you want to put a layer of implied meaning over this, someone named Jesus who can walk on water with the boat, He was also the only man in the novel who didn't come off as, a jerk.
Well, there's Gabe, who might or might not be a spirit, but
true. Yeah.
He was okay.
And what about Carter's husband? Like,
yeah,
he was okay. I thought.
Okay.
It's hard to tell.
Yeah.
I mean, we were seeing it mostly from her perspective. You could definitely see his perspective, whereas like, you're kind of flaking out. Can we just keep the kid so that he'll have a stable home?
I mean, that story makes sense.
Yeah, true. We don't really know that much about him, just that it wasn't working between them. And given Carter's behavior in the story, you can kind of see why maybe that would be the case. Carter was struggling a lot. The whole trip out to BC with a random Englishman.
Oh, yeah. What a creep that guy was.
Oh, my goodness. That whole thing made me uncomfortable, just the way people were groping her and being very, incredibly inappropriate. And she went along with it all.
Yeah, she went along with it, which was a little troublesome as well, very troublesome as well, because you want to be on her side, but then she's willingly going along with this guy who's obviously a big creep.
And has a bunch of creep friends. So.
Yeah, and the bus bathroom thing as well.
Yeah. It left me unsettled.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we talked about the buffalo. What about the dogs? What purpose to the narrative do the dogs have? Lottery and Perkins.
Were they dogs? Were Lottery and Perkins dogs? Because they keep talking about, I'm enjoying this body. You've been around for 1,000 years or something like that. They're talking to each other like they're spirits who have been around for millennia.
But they're in the body of dogs.
Yes, and that's the thing. One of the I forget which one it was, but the one who was more barky and run-aroundy was really enjoying being in a dog and enjoying all the dog sensations and the dog actions and things like that, while the other one was more like, we're in a dog, so what? But I didn't really... Like, they were almost guardian angels, guardian spirits who were protecting Genevieve, but as her dogs... So they were near her, except when she went away, and then that was really vague and unclear too.
I like the way they kind of made the best of their situation, that they're in this kennel, so they start having auditions for a little musical or something. Like, I mean,
it's very Disney.
Yeah, or kind of like, once their master or owner is out of the way or out of sight, they kind of like, okay, well, we're not going to forget her, but let's let's do this thing. Let's occupy ourselves. What was their purpose in the story, though?
I mean, I guess at the very end, they're retrieved and they sniff out, is it Carter's pregnancy? And they're like, oh, I think this one, and that's where the Jay and Solon, the names come back.
Right.
I don't know why you'd need these dogs present throughout the narrative just to have them do this thing at the end.
It may be part of the world building because, the idea that there are old spirits in the world moving through it is just kind of maybe a part of the world. And these are just that reminder. They look like dogs. They sound like dogs. They run around and sniff and take scratches, but also they're not just dogs. So maybe don't just treat dogs like dogs. Maybe. I don't know. I was expecting more from them in the story, but they kind of dropped off for a bit, and there were large sections where they just weren't really connected to the story at all. Yeah,
they definitely don't get as much narrative as like the buffalo.
Yeah, I would say the buffalo is probably one of the three main storylines. If you want, I think Carter, Genevieve, and Dee, with maybe Mame thrown in there too, just as kind of the glue. But the other characters are sort of obviously less.
I found interesting too in the bison story how the herd, all the aunties in the herd, they were very much like don't go beyond the fences, and they had developed kind of the storyline of the fences are our protection and such, which kind of flies in the face of my imagination on how bison might feel about, no, we want to run free, we want to, thunder across the prairies and such, and that would be the tradition and the story, but the tradition in the story is much more practical. Like, no, these days, like, you don't go thundering free. Stay in the fences. Stay here. Oh, they're trying to herd you into a truck. Go with them. Let them take you. That was interesting. Because in this type of story where you have these animals who would run free in the wild and then they are kind of caged and restricted, the storyline I'm familiar with is we will break free, right? Which... practically, in real terms, is a death sentence because no one's going to let a bunch of bison run free through a city or something like that. They're going to shoot them, like they did with the helicopter when they actually did go out. So the herd has adapted to the situation and has decided these are the stories. This is what will keep our group safe. And so that becomes the story they tell. But I don't know what lesson to draw from that other than... practical considerations maybe trump this noble idea of being completely independent and free.
I mean, I guess you get that with Lottery and Perkins too, right? Like once they get to the kennel, they're not trying to escape. They're just making the best of their situation.
Yeah.
And they do suggest that they could escape if
Yeah,
they wanted to.
if
They
it-
didn't have to stay.
Yeah.
Although it's not clear if that just means the spirits could leave the dogs there or if the dogs themselves would escape. I don't know.
That kind of brings me back to my initial question, which grandmother and which story, because one of the chapters, actually maybe the only chapter in the book that's actually called A Grandmother Begins the Story, happens a good ways into the story, which made me think that, are they trying to say that, all stories, when we begin a story, we're not really beginning a story. And when we end a story, the story doesn't end. We're just picking up the threads of a story for a while and telling it and then passing it on. Like Dee's son,
Tell.
Like he's the story. He's the next generation. Like there was one time when the grandmothers, the bison grandmothers, were talking about how the calves will lead us. And I like the idea that it's the next generation that will show the way. And almost like, like a river, right? When you get into a river, it's started somewhere else. And when you get out of the river downstream, it carries on. And we're only in it for a part of it. So, I mean, again, that doesn't really get us any closer to which grandmother, which story, but it's another point.
I kind of think Solon is the grandmother in the title. Because that,
Like the
because of that,
buffalo?
yeah, because that section is titled, like you said, A Grandmother Begins the Story. And that's that element right there where she's literally starting a story. Mamay isn't telling anyone a story through this. She's going through her own story, and we're hearing her tell it. But
It's not telling, it's beginning.
true.
See, I
Well,
thought
that blows up my
No,
theory.
see, I thought it was Genevieve because her action of checking herself into rehab, standing up and taking a stand and saying no more, puts a lot of these other events kind of in motion, I thought. And so she begins the story, but I don't know. It's weak. It's weak.
It's a weak theory, Trevor.
All the grandmothers and all the stories.
True. Although there are so many grandmothers. I mean, like
Yeah, exactly.
Grandma Lucy, is she telling a story?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she is unhappy. She wants to die. She's enlisting the help of her granddaughter.
Well, but she says she wants to get to the spirit world before her mom, so before Genevieve. It was never really explained why.
To spite her?
Hard to say.
I thought it was to get there so she wouldn't be alone when she gets there. But that doesn't make any sense either because Velma's already there, her sister.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, Jen is already old, like she's the oldest, so she would likely be
Yeah.
there before her anyway.
Lucy's motivations were the ones I found hardest to grasp. It didn't make a lot of sense to me. And her whole thing with Carter about, like, why are you asking me to get these for you? That's because you're not really part of the family. But also she didn't want someone else to get it for her. It had to be Carter's hands that did it. And Carter didn't understand that. And I certainly didn't understand that. It seemed a weird thing to do. And it does kind of tie in with Allie's thing about how, Lucy was toxic. You won't have a good outcome if you interact with her. She's trying to warn Carter away from her. And nothing that happened makes Allie's admonition wrong. It probably would have been better not to interact with her at all. But she did anyway. So many open questions.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about it for a while, and I think we can agree it's pretty open-ended. And there's a lot of different ways you can go with it. Our discussion here, you could probably go quite a bit further if you're interested in a particular aspect. But do you guys have any final comments you'd like to make about it before we go to our next section? Oh, we're speechless. Okay. So, yeah, it's an interesting story, definitely different, both structurally and in content than a lot of other stuff that I've read. You may find it interesting too, dear reader. So, with that said, let's go on to our next section. Can you tell me a book I would also like? Anyone got a recommendation?
I mean,
I wanted to jump in because I thought I made a really obvious choice, but I see that you did not choose the book that I've also chosen, so...
but you're making a huge assumption that this book is the book I'm going to talk about.
Fair enough,
No,
yeah.
it is.
Okay.
It is.
And your assumption is correct.
So, yeah, I don't know. No, but you can
Go.
jump in.
No, go.
No, go,
Yeah,
go. Don't fight it. Don't fight it.
All right. Well, a book that I think that you may enjoy if you also enjoyed A Grandmother Begins the Story is something called Probably Ruby by Lisa Bird Wilson. And the similarities to the book that we just discussed are that just like Michelle Porter, Lisa Bird Wilson is a poet. Mostly, she's has a background in poetry. She's from Saskatchewan, Indigenous writer, but this is her first fiction title, and it is about a woman in her 30s named Ruby. And when we meet her in the first chapter, she's kind of a mess. She has been through a series of failed relationships. She's an alcoholic, and she is trying to figure out a way that she can sleep with her therapist. Towards the end of the first chapter, the therapist asks her, "Well, what kind of kid were you?" And that sets into motion a bunch of flashbacks that are told in non-chronological order. Each chapter after the first chapter is from a different point of view of somebody that has shaped Ruby's life. And not only is it a different person, but a different time period. And so the time period stretches far back as 1950 and is up to 2018, which was present day for the course of the book. And we learn that Ruby was born to two teenage parents. Her mom was white, her dad was Indigenous, and she was placed for adoption in a family who she says weren't rich enough to care too much about her Indigenous background. And her mom would always make her wear big hats so that she wouldn't tan so much. And her adoptive father was an alcoholic and left the family, and she was left with her mom, and her mom wouldn't help her search for her birth family. And on. She finds out about a grandfather who went through the horrors of residential school, and then she connects with her birth family eventually. And so you get to get a full sort of picture of who Ruby is by the time you get to the end of the book. And it's funny, but it's also very heartfelt. Big-hearted, I think, would be one way to describe it. So probably Rudy by Lisa Bird Wilson.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so my very obvious recommendation that I thought both of you would choose is either The Break or The Strangers. Did you? No? Okay. All right. I guess they weren't as obvious as I thought. You recommended The Break recently, so I'm going to recommend The Strangers by Katerina Vermette. So they're companion books. The Strangers came out in 2021. The Break is from 2016. The Strangers is not a sequel, but it has a character who's in The Break is in The Strangers. And I think it's fair to say that Michelle Porter was very influenced by these books when writing her book. They're both about Métis families. They deal primarily with women and girls. It's a multi-generational story. The chapters are told from alternating perspectives of all the characters. But Vermette's storytelling is more straightforward than Porter's. I think it's easier to decipher the relationships between people. And Vermette is just such a phenomenal writer. She really has so much empathy for her characters. So I just pulled up the publisher description of the book because it's been a while since I read it. So I will just read that one. After time spent in foster homes, Cedar goes to live with her estranged father. Although she grapples with the pain of being separated from her mother, Elsie, and her sister Phoenix, she's hoping for a new chapter in her life, only to find herself once again in a strange house surrounded by strangers. From a youth detention center, Phoenix gives birth to a baby she'll never get to raise and tries to forgive herself for all the harm she's caused while wondering if she even should. Elsie, struggling with addiction and determined to turn her life around, is buoyed by the idea of being reunited with her daughters and strives to be someone they can depend on, unlike her own distant mother. These are the strangers, each haunted in her own way. Between flickering moments of warmth and support, the women diverge and reconnect, fighting to survive in a fractured system that pretends to offer success but expects them to fail. Facing the distinct blade of racism from those they trusted most, they urge one another to move through the darkness, all the while wondering if they'll ever emerge safely on the other side. So if you couldn't tell from that description, it's a pretty heavy book, but it's set in Winnipeg and it's so lovely. And I just found out that the third and final installment of this trilogy, I guess, for lack of a better word, which will be called The Circle, is coming out later this year. So that's exciting. Put your holds on it because it will be popular.
I still haven't read The Strangers, so I definitely should, because The Break was amazing.
If you like The Break, you'll like The Strangers.
Yeah, I think it's hard to go wrong with Katerina Vermette.
Yeah.
And I would have picked that, except I had recently mentioned The Break, and I thought that would be a little too much. It's never bad to recommend her, but, we got to try to mix it up a bit.
That's true.
So I haven't read anything quite like Grandmother Begins the Story before, so I don't have a good recommendation based on books I've read, so I'm going to suggest a book that Goodreads listed as one that other readers of this book had enjoyed. And based on the description and the author's previous work, I think it's a decent fit, and I'm probably going to want to read this one later too. It's Venko by Sherry Demeline. I'll read the description. Lucky St. James, a Métis millennial living with her cantankerous but loving grandmother Stella, is barely hanging on when she discovers she will be evicted from their tiny Toronto apartment. Then one night, something strange and irresistible calls out to Lucky. Burrowing through a wall, she finds a silver spoon etched with a crooked-nosed witch and the word Salem, humming with otherworldly energy. Hundreds of miles away in Salem, Myrna Good has been looking for Lucky. Myrna works for Venko, a front company fueled by vast resources of dark money. Lucky is familiar with the magic of her indigenous ancestors, but she has no idea that the spoon links her to Venko's network of witches throughout North America. Generations of witches have been waiting for centuries for the 7 spoons to come together, igniting a new era and restoring women to their rightful power. But as reckoning approaches, a very powerful adversary is stalking their every move. He's Jay Christos, a roguish and deadly witch hunter as old as witchcraft itself. To find the last spoon, Lucky and Stella embark on a rollicking and dangerous road trip to the darkly magical city of New Orleans, where the final showdown will determine whether Venko will usher in a new beginning or remain underground forever. So, not exactly the same as this, but...
What was the book that we read by Demeline? I can't remember.
Empire of Wild.
Yes.
Yeah.
With the werewolves.
Yeah, so I'm already convinced in her ability to write mystical, magical, interesting stuff. So I think that would be a good one. And now it's time for everyone's favorite segment, Nerd Words for Word Nerds, wherein we use words to describe other words because we like words. Who's got a word?
I have 2 words.
2?
Yeah.
That's a lot of words.
It is a lot of words.
Save one for next month.
They don't take a lot of explanation. They're words in Michif, which is one of the languages of the Métis. Michif borrows from Cree and French, and like many indigenous languages, it's considered critically endangered. There's not many speakers of it. So the words I've chosen are hello and thank you, which I think, like when I travel elsewhere into countries where they don't speak English, I find these 2 words are the first ones that I like to learn. So hello is tanshi. So it literally means how, but it also means what is the quality of you. So when you say tanshi, you're not only saying hello, you're also inquiring after the person's well-being, which is nice. And then thank you is merci. So we can really see the French influence there. Of course, merci is thank you in French, and in Michif, it's merci.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Yeah.
And those are very good words. Yeah. Although the other words you should learn are where's the bathroom?
Yeah, that one's a little more complicated. So.
Well, my nerd word comes from about a month ago on Twitter. The Merriam-Webster account started a tweet by saying, "Hey, ding-dongs." And I thought, boy, if a dictionary calls you a ding-dong, you should, pay attention. So it says, "Hey, ding-dongs, let's have a chit-chat about ablaut reduplication," which is 2 words, but one thing. Never heard this before. But if you think about it, so what this thing is all about is that if you have 3 words, the order usually goes I, A, O. And the example they give is tic-tac-toe. I, A, O. If you have 2 words together, I is the first one, and the second one is either A or O, like click-clack or King Kong. And it just seems like it's a thing that we know as English speakers. It's not something we've been taught. And they give an example of that's why these following ones don't feel quite right. Hop hip, raff riff, spot spit, flop flip, zag zig. Reverse all of those. It just feels right. Mm-hmm. And they're going to say that many brand names utilize our subconscious to their advantage. So, for example, you have Kit Kat or Ziploc, TikTok, Tic Tac, Ping Pong,
Rice-A-Roni.
Rice-A-Roni, exactly. And apparently it's so pervasive, it even occurs in phrases like the Big Bad Wolf, live, laugh, love, tick, tick, boom. So that's my word, ablaut reduplication. Well, enough of my jibber jabber. I don't mean to be wishy-washy, but I do enjoy our monthly chit-chats.
Nicely done.
Now I'm going to just be thinking of that forever now.
Yeah, you'll be thinking of the exceptions and
Yeah,
saying, what about
for
this?
sure.
What about this?
Yeah.
Yeah, you'll have to come back next month with exceptions. Every single one you find. So my word is going to be crooked, which was used throughout the book to describe the way music was played. And I found that very interesting. The definition of crooked, according to Merriam-Webster, is not straight, as in a road or a river, or dishonest, as in a politician or business person. I've played instruments of one kind or another over my lifetime, and I've heard many words used to describe styles of play, but I've never heard the crooked used in a musical sense before. And that's probably because I never played the fiddle. So I did find a page titled Crooked Tunes on a website about fiddle music around the world that talked about crookedness in fiddle music, so I found this very interesting. Most popular music has a lot of regularities and evenness to it. The patterns in music are part of what draw us into it. We like them. And there are often an even number of bars, especially in a musical phrase. And often the number of beats in a bar will be even also, like the 4/4 time signature is one of the most popular. And even if you're using an odd number of beats in a bar, like 3/4 time, like waltzing, you usually still have complete bars of music and an even number of bars. Even musical styles that use a lot of syncopation or swing, like jazz, tend to have a traditional structure like that to them. In crooked tunes, though, it's common for phrases to be an odd number of bars, and often some of those bars will not be complete. They'll either have too few beats or too many beats. So it's structurally irregular. They speculate a bit about possible reasons for that. But they did mention specifically that the Métis tradition is one with the largest number of crooked tunes. It tends to be a popular characteristic of Métis fiddle music. So I just looked all this up today, and it's making me very curious about how crookedness actually sounds in music, because I can't really imagine it easily. I've not listened to a lot of Métis reels and jigs and stuff like that, and I feel like this is a hole in my musical experience that I gotta maybe fix now, because the whole concept of crookedness in music sounds interesting to me. So, crooked.
My probably only memory of listening to extended Métis jig music was a few years ago. Remember where there's the Canada Games were hosted here in Winnipeg, and I was in a choir that was singing at the closing ceremonies. And as the athletes walked in, Sierra Noble and her band were playing a Métis jig while the athletes walked in, and she played for nonstop 25 minutes as every athlete filed into the stadium. Without, literally missing a beat, but maybe she did miss a few beats because it was crooked, but it was such an amazing experience just to listen to her play seamlessly from one melody to another for a solid 20-25 minutes.
We didn't even really touch on the music in the book and how central it was to so many of the characters, and seemed to be central to even the concept of the characters and their culture. And like I said, still a lot of stuff that could be discussed in this book, but yeah, I want to hear some crooked music. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this month. Thank you so much for joining us, dear readers. And next month, we're going to tackle The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman. In a peaceful retirement village, 4 unlikely friends meet up once a week to investigate unsolved murders. But when a brutal killing takes place on their very doorstep, the Thursday Murder Club find themselves in the middle of their first live case. Elizabeth, Joyce, Ibrahim, and Ron might be pushing 80, but they still have a few tricks up their sleeves. Can our unorthodox but brilliant gang catch the killer before it's too late? Have comments or book suggestions for us? Send us an email. You can find all our contact info at the bottom of the page at wpl-podcast.winnipeg.ca. You can also find all our past episodes there too. If you haven't already, subscribe to Time to Read on your favorite podcasting service. Maybe leave us a review. Tell your book-loving friends about us too. And until next time, make sure you find time to read.
All I need is time to read. All I need is time to read. All I need is time to read. All I ever really need is a little more time to read.
really can't stop thinking about other brand names that might have that vowel thing. You've ruined me, Trevor.
It's like when someone shows you what bad kerning looks like for fonts, and then you can never not see it anymore.
Yeah.
Or when someone tells you about the Wilhelm scream,
Right.
and then you start noticing it in all these films and TV shows.
I very much hope I hear the Wilhelm scream tonight, because I've got tickets to see the Indiana Jones.
Oh,
Ooh.
If it doesn't appear in there, it's not a proper Indiana Jones movie.
they're still putting out Indiana Jones movies.
Dude's like 80-something.
Yeah, and he looks it.
Yeah, although they apparently de-age him for some flashback scenes. So I'll see. See how it all goes.
Yeah.
I meant to watch them all with Audrey to lead up, because the three of us are going tonight. I just didn't. So I'm going to throw her into this thing. She doesn't have a clue who Indiana Jones is. It's probably kind of cruel.
She'll be fine.
I think so, right?
Yeah.
Probably the story will just...
Some of those ones are scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kalima!
Yeah,
Kalima!
yeah. I have nightmares about that. Yeah.
Literally?
No, but
Okay,
like when
good,
I
good.
think of Indiana Jones, I think of like being terrified of that scene in particular.
Where they rip the guy's heart out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.